I would like to introduce now Dr. Ashleigh Coser. She is our speaker today. She will talk about prevention of child maltreatment in American Indian families. And it's important for me to know just before I will introduce her that this is actually a topic that came out in a survey that recently we've done among those who receive emails from us. And this was one of the, I think, two main topics that was of interest for people. So I think that's a very important issue. And Dr. Ashleigh Coser is a health service psychologist with Cherokee Nation. Dr. Coser oversees and provides integrated behavioral health services across multiple clinics and is involved in trainings and service as an internship and practicum supervisor. She completed her training at OSU in clinical psychology with specialty in child clinical, doing her pre-doctoral internship at Indian Healthcare Resource Center and postdoctoral training in integrated behavior health at OU Health Center. Her research area includes examining the parent-child relationship among American Indian families and maternal mental health. And now I'll hand it into to Dr. Coser, and I will just say that we're gonna leave about 10 to 15 minutes in the end to Q&A. You're also welcome, if you're afraid you will forget your question or something like that, you're welcome to put it in the chat, but we'll attend to it just in the end. And we'll also do our short feedback survey at the end. So thank you, and thank you, Dr. Coser, for being with us here today.
Right, thank you for that introduction. My name is Ashleigh Coser, and as she mentioned, I am a health service psychologist here at Cherokee Nation. I'm excited to be here with everyone today, and so I appreciate you joining. Today I'll be talking, really kind of giving a broad overview of just some of the trends that we're seeing within our tribal communities, talking about more of a historical context for why we may see these trends within the community, giving some background so we can start to understand some of those factors that are impacting those trends, and then going more into treatment and prevention. And so one of the things I was thinking while I've been working on this presentation, and this has kind of just been a presentation that I've had and it's grown over time, is that really this type of topic can really be discussed in more of a seminar. And so to try to capture these elements within one presentation is a little bit of a challenge, and definitely is not as I mentioned, kind of more highlighting the field rather than going real in depth. And so I did want to kind of give that disclaimer. And even just within Native history, of course, that's a whole course in and of itself, and to try to capture that history and experience of American Indian communities is quite limited just within the parameters of this presentation. But I will definitely do my best and to give everyone some exposure to learning more about the community. So let me see, I will go ahead and get my presentation pulled up here. All right. So one thing about me that is real important to my identity is I belong to the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw Nations here in Oklahoma. So my experience, my research is kind of coming from those particular communities, and my knowledge from being raised among our Creek people. So I kind of have a different kind of lens just across our American Indian communities. There's quite a bit of heterogeneity just among tribal practices, cultural practices, beliefs, values. And with that too, there are some commonalities among tribes as well, and I'll be discussing that here today. So I always bring my family with me, I say, when I give presentations. And so I have my nephews and my brother, my father. So you'll see a little bit of variety here just within Oklahoma. Of course, we have, you know, it really ranges from year to year where we have, whether it's 38 or 39 federally recognized tribes here in Oklahoma. But in the top left, this is down in Carnegie, Oklahoma, among the Kiowa Gourd clan. We have stomp dance up here for, let's say, kind of more of those traditional 5 civilized tribes. Among our Creek people, that's part of our ceremonies. And so that helps to, that's a part of the ceremony, not the ceremony itself, but that's just an exhibition there. This is a part of that gourd dance, and then also just, you know, family being involved in powwows and that powwow way of life. And so again, this is just kind of my background, where I come from, my kind of lens, and what I bring to the presentation. Right. So where we begin off is just kind of taking it right from the beginning in terms of, let's get an understanding of what is currently going on within the American Indian community. And again, this is kind of more of a snapshot of just some different stats within the tribal community. So with American Indians, we're about 2.9% of the total US population that are living within the United States just within 2020. We have about 3.7 million, or 1.1% of the US population that identifies as American Indian or Alaska Native only. As of the time of this presentation, we did have 38 federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma. We also have one of the things that I think is particularly maybe opposite of what we may think, is that actually 87% of American Indians, Alaska Natives, live outside of tribal statistical areas, with only about 13% who live on reservations or other trust lands. So within 2019, what we're seeing is that we do have a considerably lower rate of individuals who are graduating with higher education degrees. Now that does look different just within Oklahoma, actually. And so we actually see quite the opposite, where we do have a higher percentage of American Indians graduating with bachelor's degree, and then even, again, as you guys can see, where we are graduating the highest number of American Indian, Alaska Native undergraduate and graduate degrees. And so among my field and psychologists, there are only about approximately 260 Indigenous psychologists just across North America. In 2019, about 84% of American Indians and Alaska Natives alone, or in combination, had at least a high school diploma, as compared to 93.3% of non-Hispanic whites. Here, we're just adding to, just to kind of give us, again, that background, but understanding with education and also household income, that were comparably lower just across the population compared to European Americans or white Americans. We do have a higher percentage of poverty level. And part of this is really to start painting a picture, to start to ask, why are we seeing these higher prevalence rates of these kind of more negative statistics? And that's where, again, we'll go into more of the history and really looking at what are those factors that may be impacting or influencing these stats that we do see within the community today. Also, just within that, just continuing with that, there may be really these non-specific or non-culturally specific factors, such as low income, poverty, low educational attainment that are really influencing some of these more mental health trends that we'll review here in a little bit. Cultural type of factors that might be there may include cultural barriers between the patient and the clinician, quality medical care. So we'll talk about Indian Health Service just in general here in a little bit in the presentation, but even within the Indian Health Service, expenditure often outweighs what they are receiving, and so they are typically chronically underfunded, geographic isolation, and again, just that low income. So here, again, it's just more of some information about what are some of the leading causes of death and just disease. We see high prevalence and risk factors for disease and causes of death, just varied within our American Indian communities. American Indians have an infant death rate of about 60% higher than the rate for white Americans. American Indians are twice as likely to have diabetes as white Americans. American Indians also have disproportionately high rates, death rates from unintentional injuries and suicide. And so, you know, the question, again, we start to have is, why are we seeing these higher rates? And so with this, just even for example of what I discussed earlier, just with our Indian Health Service, which is acquired through treaties between the federal government and tribes, being underfunded, money that may be appropriated for tribes may not actually reach the tribal communities in which they are intended. There are various factors that we're going to be reviewing, and that was just one example just throughout this presentation. And one of these things I did want to point out, because it seems like it really paints a pretty grim picture of what the American Indian community looks like. But within these, there certainly are positive, resilient factors that are occurring within our American Indian community, and definitely want to highlight those throughout this particular presentation. And so just with that, talking about, as I showed the picture of my family and those activities and cultural activities that we participate in, actually being one of those factors that have been found to help build that resiliency within American Indian communities. And so really underscoring participation in those cultural activities, whether that's powwows, if it's language revitalization, these other types of activities that may represent that patient or that family that you're working with, being involved and really helping to build that identity with their tribe and American Indian people can help with some more of those, really building those protective barriers against these particular trends that we're seeing. So here, this is highlighting that just within our youth, we have a 1.7 times higher amount of Native youth and adults for conditions including but not limited to substance use, PTSD, and suicide. We have comparable or higher prevalence of major depression compared with the general US population, and just pervasive trauma exposure. And so with that, again, that really begins to talk more about this cumulative stress experience among our minority communities, ethnic, racial, sexual orientation. And so that cumulative trauma that we see also influencing the trends that we're seeing within this particular community as well. Here in a longitudinal study of 4 reservations in the Midwestern US and 4 Canadian reserves, results showed that prevalence rates for mental health and substance use disorders increased significantly from age 10 to about 15. Results showed that an 8-fold increase in youth meeting criteria for a substance use disorder and twice as high prevalence rate for major depressive disorder during this particular time period. Conduct disorder and lifetime substance use disorder rates were 2 to 3 times higher among this group of Indigenous youth compared to the general population. Within this too, we are seeing higher prevalence rates just among those American Indian communities that are more urban versus rural. We're seeing that just among adults, PTSD estimates range from 16 to 24% of the American Indian population. Let's see. One of the things I did want to talk about with this is that when we are seeing higher rates of, let's say, these traumatic symptoms, this trauma exposure, major depressive symptoms, what we're seeing, and this is more of a study that was conducted within urban communities, which again is more representative of the population as opposed to those on reservations or more geographically isolated. But American Indians and Alaska Natives were more likely to seek mental health treatment compared to non-Hispanic whites, with some variations just by gender and psychiatric presenting complaints. Though this finding may be potentially confounded by acculturation or actually those who identify more with majority culture versus our American Indian culture, the status, as many others have discussed, low treatment engagement and retention among those who are more enculturated and those who highly identify with American Indian communities. So it's really kind of some mixed results within our data. One showing that there are comparable rates of being involved in treatment, but when you really look at the data, those are those individuals who may not have that close of a tie with American Indian identity. And then those who have lower engagement rates and retention rates and treatment who identify more as being American Indian, being from the community, being active. And so we're starting to see some discrepancies, and then just also within the American Indian community, great heterogeneity and also things that we need to take into consideration when we're working again with a patient or with the family, and not just generalizing the data or generalizing our approach to treatment or assessment even. So here in Oklahoma, European American or white children continue to have the highest rate of victimization. However, white children are victimized at a lower rate than the representation in the general population, while American Indian, Alaska Native, and Black or African American children are victimized at a higher rate than the representation in the general population. So 40% of abuse and neglect is perpetrated by the mother of the child, and this is more general Oklahoma kids. And approximately 39% is engaged by the father, while 11% were committed by individuals of no relation, among others. About 69% of those who perpetrated abuse or neglect were white, 15% American Indian, and approximately 15% African American. Those of Asian or Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander descent were at or below 0.5%. So with that, what we're also seeing is that even among these particular communities, it may not be, let's say, American Indian engaging in that abuse or neglect of that child. So with that, I really wanted to take the presentation to really starting to understand, again, why are we seeing these trends, to get really a full kind of snapshot or picture of just how these things came to be. They didn't happen in a vacuum. We want to understand those factors. That way we can work to intervene, but also to help prevent. And so among just the different areas that I wanted to point out to you, and ultimately, you know, I do want to say this has been conducted for years and years prior to me putting together this presentation. And so with this, there are several different articles and experts within the field, even within child maltreatment, such as Dr. Dolores Bigfoot, that can really just provide so much context and understanding and for why we see these particular trends within our communities as well, and also just treatment, as you'll see here in the future slides. So here I picked out just a few different things to discuss within our history, because you know, for American Indians just in general, I think it comes back to understand American Indian people. That's a big order, but for any population, but to understand any particular community. And this was something I had a similar presentation last week, where I was served on a panel, and they were really trying to understand, how do we engage American Indian families, parents, patients. Part of that is to understand where they come from. One part is culture, but then the other part is history. And that's such a big part for any community, not just American Indians, but to understand some of those historical events that have brought our people to where they are today. And so some of those key events that have happened within our history include removal and relocation. Of course, you know, those individuals may be have heard of the Trail of Tears, which was related to our 5 civilized tribes here in Oklahoma, when they were removed from their original or ancestral homelands in the East and moved to present-day Oklahoma or Indian Territory due to this belief in manifest destiny. And Andrew Jackson, who was the one to sign the Indian Removal Act, but you know, it didn't just start with that. Really beyond, and even just looking at historical documents and history books, you know, there really was just this history of seeing American Indians, let's say, as second class, as expendable. And so within this, a removal from tribal land, even, for example, for the sake of our conversation today, you know, that might have been start of that breakdown of that intergenerational transmission of cultural knowledge, of cultural practices. That could include parenting practices, just because with that removal, we lost a lot of elders. You know, over time and through that removal, we may have lost some of those cultural practices as well. And so, you know, again, that's kind of just a snapshot in talking about how history can, again, have this impact on what we're seeing today, and how we really view some of these concerns, just in terms of let's say, problematic behaviors or poor parenting practices, and that it's really not just a fact of being American Indian, but all of these other factors that are, you know, non-specific to this particular culture that is influencing these trends. So again, as I mentioned, just kind of throughout history, you're seeing just different policies and that are really negatively affecting American Indians, and really kind of more of this paternalistic type of view from the federal government in, let's say, telling how American Indians, where they need to live or how they need to live, and really taking away rights and from American Indian communities, and really kind of, you know, there's a couple of key events within our American history that I really wanted to point out here, kind of skipping forward within history. But this is where we really see more of those assimilation policies happening within American Indian communities. And here we have a picture of the Crazy Snake Band, Chickasaw, which is our Creek people. But with the General Allotment Act of 1887, this is where the federal government, after they had moved tribes here to Oklahoma, let's say they wanted to really parcel out that land to American Indians so that they could free up land for individuals to move to Oklahoma to take the land. And part of that, you know, may have been just really this belief, this bias with American Indians that they weren't necessarily taking care of the land in the way that they should, that they needed to be more Americanized. And so did I mute myself somehow? And so with the Allotment Act, again, really parceling out that land for American Indian communities here in Oklahoma, so they could open up that land. And there were rebellions, of course, among our American Indian communities here, Crazy Snake Band being one of those, and really calling for the acculturation of American Indian people. And so going alongside of that, then we're seeing as a part of that on a much broader federal level, then we're starting to see assimilation policies, including boarding schools. So here's the more infamous picture of the Carlisle Indian boarding school, where they were taking children and essentially trying to remove any cultural practices, again, because of this belief, this quote unquote understanding that American Indian cultural ways were not good ways, that they were needed to taught the correct way, which was to farm the land, to be Christian. So with this, Richard Henry Pratt is always kind of quoted with saying, "Kill the Indian and save the man." And so by the 1860s, there were 48 Indian day schools set up by the federal government near or on reservations. Indian children were that were left home. They had to leave home to attend these boarding schools. The educators would teach them how to be civilized, and it was a hope that they would go home and also teach their parents. It wasn't really working out at that time for some families, because Indian children would go home and their parents would continue to teach them their tribal ways of life. Again, that was for some, not all. In 1872, boarding school process was taken over by U.S. Army Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt. During this time, he did his own mini experiments to try and civilize Indian prisoners he had, and it seemed to work, so he decided to make these experiments even bigger. He went to different reservations and convinced families to let him take their children to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And this was very far from reservations. He thought it being this far would really diminish any tribal ties between the children and their communities. While they were at boarding schools, it was very strict schedule, military style regimen set up by the Army lieutenant. So while there have been reports, of course, of kids being lonely, homesick. There were reports of sexual and physical abuse while at the schools. Kiddos were beaten if they spoke their native language, had to wear European clothing, and speak English. From 1880 to about 1920, there were 25 off-reservation boarding schools built, and 20 to 30,000 Indian children attended these schools. By this time, there were 460 day schools near reservations, typically run by religious organizations with funding by the U.S. government. So this history is it's widely varied for a lot of families. And so it also looks different throughout the years as well. So even personally within my own family, of course, we have stories that were passed down within our family, and even just generation to generation, it seemed different. My own grandparents attended boarding schools near the turn of the century here in Oklahoma, and it looked similar to the boarding schools, let's say Carlisle, but it also looked different. So the reason why they went there was not necessarily to make them less native and more majority culture, but was actually more out of racist attitudes and policies, and that they were not allowed to attend public school because they were native. So then they had to also then go to boarding schools here within Oklahoma, far away from their hometown. And so that's like Colony among the Cheyenne and Arapaho. That's where my grandpa went. And then also just one example, both my grandmas went up towards Ponca City and went to school up at Chilocco Indian Boarding School. So again, just a lot of wide variability in terms of the stories that we hear from our family members, but we start to see this trickle down effect of these events that have been ongoing. So whether that, as we mentioned before, the lack of transmission of those cultural practices, including more of that maybe traditional Native parenting, of those cultural practices of, let's say, beliefs on, let's say, naming ceremonies or even birthing ceremonies, coming of age ceremonies, all of these things over time and through this assimilation process have been just kind of taken away slowly but surely throughout generations. One thing too, just to add to that, I can't also underscore this enough, but as you guys can imagine, being told that being American Indian, let's say, isn't right or it isn't good, you need to be more majority culture or Christian, then that starts to internalize. And so some may call it that internalized racism. And so we might start to see that among, our tribal people as well, that they don't like the way they see themselves, or they don't like, or they may think, oh, my parents still engage in these tribal ceremonies, but that's not right, or they shouldn't be doing that. And so we start to see that among our people as well. And just thinking how that might be impacting one's mental health and those symptoms that may come along with that. So I'm going to kind of fast forward again through history and really get more into some of these highlights and then into treatment and assessment. But with this, we're really seeing some shifts within the federal kind of view of American Indians. And so we're really shifting from paternalism to actual partnership and the establishment of more tribal constitutions and tribal sovereignty, getting that established. And so Nixon actually rejected past governmental policies towards American Indians and wanted to move towards a new relationship between the federal government and Indian communities, moving from, again, this paternalism to partnership. And for Indian communities, it meant them making their own decisions, running their own affairs, determining what's best in line with their own culture and values. And with Nixon's goal, Congress enacted a number of laws to improve tribes in various ways, and a few, or one of those includes the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so here, again, wanted to give some general information on the Indian Child Welfare Act. I see a few familiar names and faces just on the presentation today that may actually, be able to provide a lot more, just even detailed information and historical information on Indian Child Welfare Act. But with this, Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, is a federal standard prioritizing Native children's placement with their nuclear or extended family, a tribal member, or other Native before being placed in non-Native American foster or adoptive homes. And so this was enacted by Congress in 1978. And during this time, state and private agencies removed as many as 25 to 35% of Native children from their families and placed many in non-Native foster homes before the law was enacted. And just within this, again, knowing that historical context and that those attitudes, beliefs, biases that were about American Indians, what we see even just through the literature is that American Indian parents were seen as highly permissive, as let's say maybe the kiddos were in one home and then living with an aunt the next week and then living with grandma. So looked as though the environment may have been unstable. And so without really understanding in terms of cultural context, historical context, but more so just seeing that this wasn't more of a westernized way of parenting, then, that may be owing to some of, let's say, that maybe even implicit bias that was happening in removal of Native children from their homes. Presently, Native families are 4 times more likely to have their children removed and placed in foster care compared to white families, just according to the National Indian Child Welfare Association. And following past government programs, this resulted in really that widespread and unwarranted removal of Native children from their families over the previous century, which again led to this established act. Just here in recent news, the Supreme Court last fall heard oral arguments in a series of 4 consolidated cases challenging the constitutionality of this landmark law. Plaintiffs included several non-Native couples trying to adopt or foster children from tribal nations. It included a woman who wanted her child of Native descent to be adopted by non-Native people, and also involved the states of Texas, Louisiana, and Indiana. And just with that, a federal district court judge in 2018 ruled that ICWA was unconstitutional, and that was appealed. And the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case after the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled some parts of ICWA as constitutional, while others violated the anti-commandeering policy of the Constitution. So again, what we're seeing here is this Welfare Act that was enacted in '78 for these particular reasons, for the protection of American Indian children. But yet we're still seeing just within our judicial system threats to this law, or this act, not the law. So ICWA provides guidance to states regarding the handling of child abuse and neglect and adoption cases involving Native children, and sets minimum standards for handling these cases. Among its added protections for Native children, ICWA requires caseworkers to make several considerations when handling an ICWA case. So that may include, or often includes, providing active efforts to the family, identifying a placement that fits under the ICWA preference provisions, notifying the child's tribe and the child's parents of the child custody proceeding, and actively working to involve the child's tribe and the child's parents in the proceedings. Because these added protections address not only specific system abuses directed at Native children, but also their unique political status as sovereign nations and cultural considerations, ICWA has been labeled the gold standard of child welfare policy by various experts and national leading child advocacy organizations far beyond just within tribal communities. So although progress has been made really as a result of Indian Child Welfare Act, out-of-home placement still occurs more frequently for Native children than it does for the general population. So in spite of the advances that we've achieved with ICWA in 1978, or since 1978, ICWA's protections are still very much needed for the tribal community. One of the historical type of highlights that I talk about with classes and talking with individuals who may be working with American Indians, or just really interested in the American Indian community and history, is that when we're talking through those historical events that have happened and talking about parenting and abuse in this kind of context, not necessarily child abuse, but there have been these discriminatory attitudes towards American Indian parents and families, again, as I mentioned before, as dysfunctional, parents as not being fit for being parents. These attitudes justified assaults on American Indian families, and particularly women and children. And with this, in 1974, a Choctaw doctor, actually here in Oklahoma, Indian Health Services in Claremore, found that women were being sterilized at that particular clinic without their informed consent or their awareness. There was an investigation completed at that time and actually found that 4 of the 12 Indian Health Services clinics were actually engaging in this process of sterilization. And they found that over 3,000 Native women aged 15 to 54 were sterilized against their will in a coercive way between 1973 and 1976. They were threatened that their medical benefits would end or their children would be taken away if they did not consent to the procedure. So as you can imagine, there were devastating effects on children, women, families, continued health problems following that and psychological effects, one of which may, negatively impact our patients from seeking out treatment. We've, kind of more anecdotal evidence in working in Indian health. We've heard that from patients that they don't trust medical, they don't trust social services, behavioral health, because of these different historical events. And so again, that's why trying to give some understanding to that particular community that you may be working with, why there may be less engagement, less retention, and how can we help to reverse some of that now that we know some of these concerns for the particular community. One thing about this, and I really want to point that out, is that we think about these things as being historical, and they are, but they were only, let's say, just one generation away from the generation that we're treating now. So my mother actually, she gave birth to my sister at Telehina Clinic, which is down in Choctaw country. My mom's Choctaw and Chickasaw, and they actually tried to force her to have a hysterectomy because they told her, you have one child, that's enough, you don't need more. And so she tells us that story and would tell us about that. And so again, it's not so historical in the events for families. And then those stories are passed down to help protect their children and younger generations, and to also just give an understanding of just, the community, the world they're living in, and ultimately to help protect them. I go a little bit more into this because, again, it gives some current context for the families and for the patients you may be working with. So, and again, I am not coming from more of a legal background, and so I give more of a brief overview of this. But recently we had a case within Oklahoma that went to the Supreme Court, and that was McGirt versus Oklahoma back in 2020. And ultimately, from that Supreme Court decision, then we have this recognition of the Muscogee Creek Reservation. And this included that any crime committed on tribal land, whether that was Indian on Indian crime, even off tribal land, then this was a federal crime. And so Oklahoma courts don't have jurisdiction over federal criminal law. And with this is also, this happened in 2020, and we've kind of been waiting over time to see how has this decision, how is it going to be impacting our services that we provide today. And we certainly are starting to see, just from a tribal perspective and behavioral health, how that is starting to trickle down to us. So here with this, as we mentioned before on the previous slide, it didn't dissolve those reservation lands. So the whole state of Oklahoma really, as you can see, except for the Panhandle, is made up of tribal land. So let's get more into talking about kind of this, what we've been discussing so far as this historical or intergenerational trauma. So historical trauma is really the collective, cumulative psychological wounds of massive, repeated transgenerational group trauma. Really, historical trauma has had its roots among the Jewish people and the experience during the Holocaust, but certainly can be applied to other, let's say, historically marginalized communities. So historical trauma is an important aspect or important part of the American Indian psychological experience and is a mechanism that limits treatment engagement and contributes to ongoing depression, unresolved grief, and traumatic responses. Intergenerational trauma, which may be the loss of culture, including traditional family roles, traditional or cultural practices around certain behaviors, understanding. It also includes, maybe instead of the transmission of those traditional parenting practices, let's say we have a family who had members attend boarding schools and went through that type of experience that I discussed before, where there was sexual, physical, psychological abuse occurring. Then, as you can imagine, when they returned home, or if they were to start maybe a new life away from their tribal community and to start a family, and they were raised in that boarding school, what do we think then they would engage? What type of parenting practices would they engage in? We're also seeing, even just in that example, now that particular individual is away from their community, maybe away from that family support that would have been there had they gone back to that particular community. We also kind of, briefly discussed that internalized racism that might have been happening, and maybe now they're living in an urban area among predominantly white Americans. So you can really start to see this picture building potentially of maybe what was happening for these families, let's say even just one generation ago, 2 generations ago. To give some really kind of understanding, because I think it's important, again, just with maybe the audience and who may be present within the audience. I've been talking a lot more in the previous slides about Indian Health Services, and the United States has a legal responsibility to provide healthcare services to American Indians and Alaska Natives as part of the government-to-government relationship with tribal nations, dating back to the history of treaties signed with tribes. The programs administer medical services, dental services, ranges from community services to also alcohol and drug use prevention, education, treatment, also including mental health services. And so IHS provides a comprehensive health service delivery system for approximately 2.6 million of the nation's estimated 3.7 million American Indians and Alaska Natives. Typically, urban clientele has less accessibility to hospitals, health clinics, or contract health programs provided by IHS and tribal health programs. Approximately 70% of American Indians and Alaska Natives live in urban areas, just as a reminder. Just within Oklahoma, we actually have several sites. So Cherokee Nation is not an IHS facility, but we do have a compact with IHS that enables us to see a wider variety of patients, and not just Cherokee tribal members, but any Native that wants to establish a chart here. We have several IHS sites in Oklahoma, such as those closer in proximity to Tulsa, and up there we have Pawnee Indian Health Service, Claremore. We have what we can see here is that urban centers such as Indian Healthcare Resource Center in Tulsa can provide just services to Natives who live in those urban areas. They have IHS facilities in Chicago, Minneapolis, Boston, Portland, and San Diego, just for example. So I think it's also just important to be informed of these locations as we, as clinicians or providers, we may encounter American Indian families who either may not have third-party insurance or Medicaid, Medicare, and if so, these locations may provide those services, whether it's behavioral health or even just health in general, and are scattered throughout Oklahoma and many other states, not just only Oklahoma. So this information can be accessed by the IHS website, and it's often that the healthcare facility has behavioral health services, and if not, then they may contract with other facilities or agencies. So here, I really kind of wanted to change track and to really start even discussing, now that we have an understanding of some of those statistics that we see within American Indian communities, we have some historical context, highlighting a few of those events that are very significant within American Indian communities. Now, what do we do? And so this is where I start to try to answer some of those questions. So with this, what we've seen just through research is that there's a direct link between historical trauma, which is also called historical loss, and depression, anxiety, substance use, and is also indirectly related or linked to suicidal ideation. So we have, there are burgeoning viewpoints that really assert that if colonialism or intergenerational historical loss are recognized as the identified problem, then it follows that interventions with American Indians and Alaska Natives should be focused on cultural reassertion or getting them more involved in their culture and revitalization, both at the individual level and also at the community level, that we would start to see reductions in those mental health symptoms. So what we're seeing here is that there are some common themes to define traditional healing, which may include and may be a part of those treatments. And I highlight just three actual treatments that we know have been adapted, modified, culturally enhanced, evidence-based treatments that I'll review here in a little bit. But again, just along across those types of treatments, we do have these common themes that we use when working with American Indian families, and that includes a strong identification with relationships. So relationship to family, to their community, to a higher spiritual power, to the environment. There's personal characteristics that are common among American Indians. So let's say, for example, trust in traditional healing practices or processes. Humor among our American Indian people is a common theme. We also see just among these different types of treatments is that really investing in continuing that culture, that history, and those teachings are vital. So let's talk more. One of the things that we're having to hold at the same time is that when we really look at the data, that we have very little data to show that we actually fully need adaptations and we need these modifications. And I bring this up because a lot of times in conversations in our professional organizations, clinicians will say, well, I need to have that adaptation, or that wasn't, let's say that measure wasn't normed on American Indian communities. And so if they aren't normed on Native communities, or there isn't an adaptation, then what do we do? That's kind of where we're left with, because oftentimes when within psychological research, American Indians are harder to reach, or as we mentioned before, harder to engage potentially in research. They may be just lumped into other category because maybe we had less than a 1% representation within that sample. And so there really is a dearth of just research in general within the psychological field. But that really begs the question, if we don't have a norming population to analyze these type of measures, if we don't have them involved in those treatment trials, then how do we know which type of assessment and which type of treatment is going to be effective for this particular community? And when we look at the data in this particular article, in this review of articles, really looks at that there's the data that we have just even across racial and ethnic minorities is that evidence-based treatments, let's say, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, parent-child interaction therapy, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, these generally are effective among ethnic and racial minorities. What we don't have the data is actually to show the opposite, that it negatively affects these minority communities. And so in addition to that, what we're seeing is that among racial and ethnic minority communities is that adaptations of, let's say, PCIT, of TFCBT, CBT, that after, let's say, months of that, the conclusion of these RCTs or randomized controlled trials of these particular evidence-based treatments, that both the standard protocol of CBT, for example, and the adaptation of CBT, they perform the same. So there was really no added benefit necessarily of these adaptations. Now, that's not to say we should not have adaptations or that we shouldn't use them or that we don't need the research. It's not saying that. It's just right now we have data that just doesn't show that standard treatments are harmful to these communities. And again, you can't generalize that necessarily, but just looking at the data, that's what we're seeing. So there's certainly really just needed assessment, further research studies, especially within the American Indian community, to really look into what are the treatment outcomes, are these measures that we use, like, let's say, CATS with trauma screener, is that actually effectively measuring trauma symptoms within American Indian patients? So within this too, there are things that we need to take into consideration even when we're trying to assess for a patient. And this isn't, I would say, not only just within trying to assess symptoms, mental health symptoms with a patient that's sitting across from me, but even, let's say, a caseworker, a DHS worker, and you're working with a family and you're trying to understand where they're coming from, you're trying to get a hold of their assessment of their functioning. These are things to bring to that meeting. And these are things that I'm going to end the presentation talking about, of those commonalities in terms of traits and also values of American Indian people that I believe not only our community has, but will be important for that clinician, that provider, that caseworker to bring into that interaction with that patient and that family. And part of that is that understanding of cultural humility. And I think social workers really lead the way on that understanding of cultural humility versus cultural competency. And really coming from a place of really trying to understand the person that's sitting across from you, that family that's sitting across from you, and understanding that I am not going to be the expert on anyone's culture or their experience, even though I'm myself am full blood and I come from my particular tribal community. I do not consider myself an expert by any means on Creek people, Choctaw people. And so, even from my standpoint, I have so much more to learn. And that, again, is going to be a common trait that I'll talk about just within our American Indian communities that we see, that there's this interdependence that is really about the community and not about the individual. Rather than being, let's say, I do things for my own, let's say, glory or to achieve these goals, it's more, I do this and I represent my community. I don't only represent myself, I represent my family. And so understanding just that connection between that patient and their level of thinking, as well as every person you meet within the American Indian community has a varying acculturation level. Even though you may visit with someone who may phenotypically look like an American Indian, black hair, darker tan skin, does not automatically mean that they, let's say, know their language, have a strong identity with being American Indian, know those cultural practices. And so again, a part of that cultural humility is just coming in and trying to understand that person and where they're coming from. So here we get more into talking about those actual treatments, those interventions for our children and those families who are endorsing subclinical, clinical levels of trauma symptoms. And so we have TFCBT, or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And here I just give more of a brief overview, and then towards the end, I'll talk about more of that specific adaptation or modification that has been created for American Indian communities. And so with TFCBT, as it states, the average number of sessions is anywhere from 12 to 25 sessions based on, whether that's severity of clinical presentation, whether, having to revisit or even having to share, let's say, that trauma narrative over again to help with that exposure for that patient can really range. And TFCBT addresses not only PTSD type symptoms, but may be able to, and has been demonstrated to, treat depression, anxiety, externalizing behaviors. Of course, these are symptoms that we often see as comorbid with that PTSD diagnosis, and really has a wide range for individuals that may benefit from TFCBT. Here is just a quick, for those of you who are trained in TFCBT, know about the practice skills. Just generally, TFCBT is designed to reduce children's negative emotional and behavioral responses to these trauma exposures, and correct these unwanted and maladaptive trauma-related beliefs and attributions, like, let's say, this is my fault, or I caused this to happen. TFCBT utilizes this gradual exposure to decondition emotional associations to memories and reminders of the traumatic event, correcting those distorted cognitions about the event and negative attributions about themselves, others, and the world. Parents are included and are a big part of the treatment process to enhance the support for the child. It helps to reduce that parental distress that may happen. and teach strategies to manage child emotional and behavioral reactions. And so one of the things just with TFCBT is, again, it's more of an intervention. So these kiddos have been through that traumatic experience and are out of that traumatic experience. And after a time frame of experiencing these different PTSD domain symptoms, if they were to meet criteria, then would be potentially a good fit for this particular treatment. This goes through each of the components of TFCBT, and I won't go into each of those. So I will continue on and talk more about this particular adaptation. So one of the things that I do want to point out, just with that discussion I had on before about adaptations or modifications, and working with OU Health Sciences Center and working with Dr. Schmidt, Susan Schmidt, and working with Dr. Beverly Funderburk and Dr. Bigfoot, Dr. Jane Selewski is learning more about just how did they do this adaptation process and what does that look like, and with each of these adaptations and modifications and cultural enhancements, there's all these words that are used to describe the process that they utilize in order to try to encourage that treatment engagement and that treatment retention. That way we can help to ultimately reduce those symptoms that brought that patient and that family in. There's really limited data on these. And so I want to give that kind of disclaimer. And so talking again with the creators of these particular presentations, they're still collecting data to demonstrate the effectiveness of these, but they have been in talking with families, that families do tell and share that these treatments were helpful, that it helped them to connect back to those cultural practices and those beliefs, that they felt heard, that it did help again with those elements of engaging the families. And so with this particular adaptation, some of the people here today may have been a part of these trainings, but it's a Healing Children, Amending the Circle treatment adaptation of TFCBT. And Dr. Bigfoot writes that the TFCBT, really that model is actually culturally congruent with American Indian practices and understandings. In that traditional teaching and beliefs such as supporting caregivers, the family, the patient is central to American Indian families. Attending to and listening to children, telling about experiences through storytelling or ceremony happens within our tribal communities. And relationships among emotions and beliefs and behaviors, all of these things that are embedded within that treatment model are actually already occurring within our understanding of cultural practices among American Indian families. Now, that may not be the case among every, again, American Indian family, but culturally, that's what was happening already. So bringing that family back or providing that education, discussing these things may be helpful in engaging them and also bringing them, like revitalizing some of that cultural aspect. So part of just the adaptation, how it was created, is that they engaged tribal partners, including stakeholders like tribal leadership, consumers, traditional and society helpers and healers, local programs such as schools, tribal colleges, behavioral health, law enforcement, and other providers. Common cultural practices and concepts were found just talking with these stakeholder groups. And so tribal communities that involved extended family, potentially as part of treatment. So I mentioned this briefly before, but among our more, let's say, traditional families, there are these roles, let's say, among our people, the Creek people. The aunt has a role in disciplining their nieces and nephews. And it's the parent may not have that role, but it's the aunt's role to do that and the uncle's role to do that. And so they step in there and they do that. And so again, it may vary by tribe, and often does vary by tribe and their cultural practices. And so with that, if we are interviewing that family and start to understand their roles within the family and who does the disciplining, who does this and that, then that might be a part of the treatment involving that extended family member in treatment, because they're the main ones who do the disciplining. They're the ones who provide the caretaking of the kiddo. And that's not necessarily the parent being neglectful of their parenting duties, but more of a cultural practice. And in order to understand that or to really get at that, that's more of just your assessment with that family. And that's actually more of my my thesis and dissertation work was actually looking at extended family involvement in our American Indian families. One of the things I'll just comment on the imbalance that's discussed within the treatment model, and then also the oral story. So imbalance comes from, let's say, just if there's trauma happening within the family, then things are off kilter for the family. And that just makes sense in general population. Something happens, then the family functioning is off. That's very much a cultural understanding among our tribal communities as well. And so when this occurs, it may manifest in many different ways, including unhealthy behaviors and distorted beliefs. Another aspect of the treatment is oral stories. And so that therapists and family identified together the method for telling the trauma story. And that could be such as a written story, a journey stick, or a traditional dance that the patient and or the family may engage in. And so again, that's really kind of a snapshot of that adaptation of this particular treatment. So there are various levels at which that adaptation really takes place. And so we will go on to the next one. This one is by Dr. Terry Cross, who is a phenomenal individual who's written lots and lots of articles, book chapters, and is the one who created this positive Indian parenting program that's actually recognized by the National Indian Child Welfare Association as a treatment for parents who may be at risk for engaging in maltreatment. And this one, again, is just more of a snapshot, is an 8-session treatment program. There's 2 parts to it. So this is where they actually have parents engage in those traditional practices, or begin to discuss what those traditional practices are for their tribe, as well as just those shared commonalities among American Indian people. And the second part is actually applying those skills. So as a participant of positive Indian parenting, for example, you'll hear the lessons of a storyteller and how to apply the concepts that are important in our oral traditions to communicate with your children. You'll hear about the lessons of the cradle board and how to apply those, like how to apply nurturing ways And this is more of that description on that particular website from the National Indian Child Welfare Association. And also just learning more about traditional behavioral management and what that looked like potentially historically for our communities and being able to use them today. This one, we again probably are aware of just within the general population, but parent-child interaction therapy, or PCIT, actually has been modified for American Indian populations. And so with PCIT, kiddos range from 2 to 7. It can range from 14 to 25 sessions. And that's really dependent on, let's say, on the parenting side, how fast and how, I guess more so how quickly are parents picking up the skills and how quickly can they master the skills. And then on the kiddo side, maybe we need a little bit more, a couple more sessions to help curb some of that problematic behavior in the second part of treatment. And part of that may be helping to support that parent to address that non-compliant behavior in the second part of treatment. So it really ranges in terms of the number of sessions for PCIT. So there's two parts. There's the child-directed interaction and the parent-directed interaction. And it uses this two-stage approach aimed at improving the parent or caregiver-child relationship by changing patterns of interactions and implementation of a positive discipline program. So right there, I think this very much opens it up to being congruent with a lot of different maybe communities where it's not only just about the parent, but it's just the caregiver, and using that broadly, whether that's grandma and that's aunt, then they can be included in there too. And also, even if we have, let's say, a kiddo in a new placement, then that foster or adoptive parent may be able to engage in this particular treatment to help with that, fostering that relationship between the caregiver and the child. The components involve teaching skills and live coaching of the skills and feedback. The goals of treatment are strengthening that relationship, improving pro-social behavior in the kiddos, decreasing negative behaviors, improvement in frustration tolerance and anger management, decreasing parenting stress. And this one, though it's not directly targeting PTSD, then we know, let's say we have a parent who had previously engaged in abuse or neglect and had been reunified with the kiddo, then this may be very well a specific treatment that may be recommended to help, again, with that fostering of that relationship, and has been actually looked at and helping to reduce that recidivism within the DHS system. So this is just a picture of the skills that go alongside with PCIT. So with the pride skills, we're providing label praises, we're providing reflections of what the child is doing, we're imitating that play during that special play time, which is only 5 minutes per day. We're describing behavior, and we're just enjoying that time that we have with the kiddo. And so it's reinforcing for that kiddo's pro-social behavior. We're praising. We know that when we provide a praise, we're reinforcing that behavior, and it's more likely to occur over time. And so we want to be very specific about what we're praising. I love it when you use your manners. And so we're specifically sharing with that kiddo what we want to see. It shows our approval of them. It helps to increase their communication. So even just by describing their behavior of, oh, you're coloring a butterfly. You chose the color, let's say violet. And so let's say the kiddo says, yeah, I am using violet. And so maybe right then and there you taught them a new word. And so while that's not the direct target for the treatment, we are seeing these more distal type factors that are happening that are really reinforcing, again, these kind of more pro-social, pro-development skills within the kiddos who are participating in the treatment, as well as just helping with more of that sustained attention on one task. That can help just lengthen that attention for a kiddo, especially, of course, with ADHD or disruptive behavior problems. So similar to what we see with TFCBT, and as I mentioned, Dr. Bigfoot really has been the lead person within this field of parent-child research and adaptations to treatment. So her and Bev Funderburk created this modification to PCIT to help enhance that engagement and understanding for American Indians participating in this treatment. And across the board, both for TFCBT and PCIT with American Indian families, is that they, the data that they do present in their articles is that it helped with just the feedback from the families is that they would like to engage in this treatment, that it appeared appropriate, culturally appropriate for them, and that they appreciated that the clinician brought these aspects into treatment. And so as I've been going along here, I've been talking about just that involvement of the community. So it may be those extended family members. Really within our tribal communities, we view children as a gift from our Creator, and that with that understanding that children are from the Creator, then we provide or we engage in ceremonies to honor their life. So if that, again, like a birthing ceremony or a coming of age ceremony, bringing them into one of those pictures of my family, my nephews were being inducted into the Kiowa Gord clan. And so for them, that was almost like a coming of age. It was a ceremony indicating that they were demonstrating their maturity, and that they also were tying them back to that community, and that they answered to the community and that they represented it. And so traditionally within American Indian communities, this was a normal practice. And so for those that may have gotten away from that practice, whether that was due to history, of trauma, if that was assimilation that happened, then by bringing this into treatment, then we may be able to bring part of that back, that practice back for that family. And so there are just embedded within our communities, just more discipline strategies that are more direct or indirect. So this may look like families speaking to the child about their behavior directly or indirectly by ignoring, allowing the child to learn through natural consequences, and also really telling oral stories to children to share with them about lessons. So among, like within my family, they may talk about what we call hunkas or like monsters, or, there's these certain lessons that you have to learn within the stories, but they tell you why certain things are the way they are. They tell you what to avoid. And so again, these cultural stories that have been passed on from generation to generation were teachings and lessons for these kiddos, younger generations. But again, through history, through assimilation, through trauma, these may have been essentially taken away from some of these families. And so by implementing that within treatment, we're not only teaching these positive parenting practices, but we are helping to re-engage that family in those cultural practices. So here, just taking a look or keeping my eye on the time, I may go ahead and skip through a few of these and kind of more briefly go over them. This is talking about actually some of the work that we're doing here at Cherokee Nation to help with prevention. And so I certainly want to highlight what are some of those preventative areas that we can help with our Native communities. And one of those things is just what we've been talking about, is that reconnecting to culture, revitalization of whether that's language or engaging in those cultural practices. Another way that we're doing within behavioral health is taking it way back to even working prenatally and working with moms who are pregnant. And for me as a child psychologist, what better way of preventative work than to work with a parent and the family before baby gets here. And we know that even in utero, there are, if we have a mom who is significantly depressed or anxious, then that still has an effect on that baby in utero. And so this is where we get more into doing that preventative work and maybe kind of more secondary prevention for the moms, and then maybe more primary and or secondary prevention for the children too. So here we really target perinatal mood and anxiety disorders among our Native moms. And what we know is that there's a large percentage, even beyond the general population, of moms who are experiencing these rates of mood and anxiety disorders. And so we know that about 1 out of 5 women are affected by PMADs. And we have a higher prevalence rate of PMADs compared to even just rates of gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, and gestational diabetes. Yet despite that higher prevalence, what we'll see here in a little bit is that it's often undetected, underdiagnosed, and undertreated. We also see that just among dads, that new dads, that there's upwards of about 10% of new dads who report and endorse significant depressive symptoms. One of the things too that goes alongside of that is that among those fathers, only about 3% actually sought out treatment. With PMADs too, one of the things that we see is that it affects everyone. There's similar rates of postpartum throughout the world compared to the US and Western parts of Europe. Unlike other behavioral health diagnoses, socioeconomic status or income is actually not protective against PMADs. We do see variation just among our racial and ethnic minority communities. And I'll get into that here a little bit later, just within our tribal communities. So as I mentioned before, it is often underdiagnosed and undertreated. Primarily, or I should say one of the main reasons is because there isn't necessarily universal screening across different clinics, health clinics, and so it then goes undetected unless a patient discusses it with their healthcare provider. And so what we see is that of those actually experiencing those clinical symptoms, only about half during their prenatal period were detected, and 30% of those in the postpartum were detected via screening. And a seminal article by Cox and colleagues in 2016 indicated that only 8.6% of women prenatally and 6.3% of women in postpartum actually received adequate treatment after being detected. So very low rates of those that are needing treatment to actually receive adequate treatment, not even, it's more like just good enough treatment. So what we know, and why I bring it up for this presentation, is that the risks of untreated PMADs can have just effects not only on the patient, but the child and the family functioning as well. And so generally we see just increased medical costs due to ER visits, child abuse and neglect, earlier discontinuation of breastfeeding, poor adherence to medical care, disability, and just an exacerbation of medical conditions related to that, as well as interpersonal violence, substance abuse, separation, divorce. We see a higher prevalence rate of that within individuals who do have untreated PMADs. So here, just again, kind of a continued list of risks if we leave those untreated. We take more of a look at those factors that help to understand why these things come about, and more of a psychosocial approach to the understanding of PMADs, and also trying to take more of a closer look as to why we have cultural differences in prevalence rates among our racial and ethnic minority communities, given the unequal distribution and really kind of limited research on that. And really what we do know is it's pointing to those social determinants of health that are really influencing this unequal distribution. So here's just a snapshot of the screening that typically happens. I'm going to focus a little bit more on this EPDS, but then just kind of breeze through some of these so I can get to what I really want to talk about and leave, kind of wrap up this presentation. And I will go over here. So to American Indian PMADs. So with this, again, Dartmouth research, limited research on American Indian communities. It's not only among PMADs, but what we're seeing is that, so previously we said about 10% of the general population have PMADs. Within the literature, it is estimating that among American Indians, it's about 23 to 29% of the population are actually meeting criteria for PMADs. And that's actually some of the research that's actually coming out of Oklahoma too, and just more of survey data that's gone out. One of the things is that just in comparison to other communities of color and also just white Americans, is that American Indian communities may have the highest, or they do have the highest rates of major and minor depression, just with these various studies. So one of the things that we've done here at Cherokee Nation was really trying to understand more of what is the actual occurrence rate that we're seeing within our population, as well as, or within our community, our sample, not population. And is this screening tool actually effective at measuring depression? So that ultimately, in order to answer these questions, we need to have answers to these questions because of all of those potential effects of if we don't screen correctly, if we don't identify those moms, then we have all of those risks really kind of weighing on this. And we found that the Edinburgh measure that in terms of our statistical analyses, so we ran some various kind of more complicated statistical analyses, but what we found is that generally it was measuring postpartum depression among our American Indian sample, but it wasn't fully capturing what maternal depression looked like for our community. And so we were really kind of next steps for our research is really trying to understand what does that look like for our community, because this questionnaire, while it is getting some of that information, it's really just not tapping into what does that postpartum look like for American Indians. And so that's really kind of the aim of what we're doing, and really trying to improve access to care by just providing education to all patients who are coming through our OBGYN clinics, by making that connection with them. If, let's say, we have a patient who endorsed several answers on that EPDS measure, then we can come in and meet with them, talk about our services, normalize just that experience of feeling down, feeling frustrated, even providing education on even if it's just baby blues versus that true PMADS that people experience. And then ultimately, if we need a referral, then we can make that for those patients. So that's really kind of a snapshot of what we do within that particular visit. These are some things that we hope to do in the future by really increasing our reach and really wanting to work with dads that are coming through, because that's really kind of been a gap in the care that we've been providing so far, increasing our workforce and being able to actually start to implement even some different therapeutic approaches within this community or this specific population. So here is really kind of where I want to start to wrap us up and to really kind of leave each person with some nuggets that they can take away from this. And again, to me, as a clinician, as a researcher, I think ultimately these are things that, and even just as a Native person myself, this is what I want people to know, clinicians to know, faculty to know, whatever role you may be in. And these are traits and values of American Indian people that are celebrated, and hopefully, you work towards potentially understanding if that's asking questions or reading more about our communities. And so people talk about within American Indian communities, time is nonlinear. We have the joke that we have Indian time. We just kind of show up when we get there, which is usually like 10 minutes late. But we also, I think about it in the way I was recently attending a funeral, and one of my uncles had shared, we end when we end. It might have said on the program we ended at 1 o'clock, but if we're still there at 3 o'clock, we end when the ceremony ends. There is no time definition to it, because we want to do things in a good way, in a correct way. And so we're not stuck to these kind of westernized linear time frames. Oral tradition. I always tease when I give presentations. It may seem like I'm kind of circular in the sense of like, what is she trying to bring us to, or what is she trying to make us to understand? But it may be looking like it's circular in the way that I'm talking around issues, but there's ultimately a purpose and a goal there, and bringing it right back to the purpose for that story or that lesson. That we're relational. We've talked about this just throughout the presentation. Balance and just that imbalance that we talked about with TFCBT as being an important component of that. For American Indian people, balance with whether that's walking, or, there's some old literature talking about walking in two worlds, where American Indian, and this isn't only American Indian people, but Native people are practicing their tribal beliefs while also being a part of majority culture, and having to have that balance. And if one is a little bit more than the other, then again, we start to see, the creeping up of maybe some symptoms or unhealthy behaviors. And that's just one example of what that balance may look like. We talked about humility. One other big value of American Indian people is silence. So oftentimes, and this even goes along with abuse and neglect, child abuse and neglect, also just talking about parents. And so among American Indian people, silence is valued. Not talking, me coming up here and talking like I am and kind of talking in an expert role is like the antithesis of how we practice in our tribal communities. We more oftentimes are sitting in silence and listening to other people. We are taking in the information, not because, historically, they may have seen that as someone being slower functioning, cognitive functioning. But rather than that, it's more of just a cultural practice of that person listening and, deciding when to talk. We don't just talk to talk among our Indian people. Humor, we've talked about before. Family, these are, again, such big components of our American Indian communities. And so bringing back that family together, bringing back that culture of honoring elders, children, involving them in that cultural practice, definitely, there's been multiple studies to show that of how important that connection is to our tribal people. And then also just spirituality and culture. So spirituality and culture, for many people, that's one and the same. In our teachings and practices, we often start activities with prayer. This is important and tied with the concept of balance. Scholars have also discussed this in our practice of psychological treatment and research. So this makes sense in that we are working with families and people's mental health. And how significant of a work is that? And so even people like myself who provide that care should have that balance and should, do things in a good way or the right way. And so we do this through that ceremony and prayer. And if we're not balanced, let's say, and I'm working with a patient, then I could make them more sick. And so that's a lot more complicated beyond this presentation, but again, these are some of the beliefs that we do have among our tribal people. So some of these things, as I mentioned before, and I'll end with this, were misinterpreted, maybe as depressive symptoms. So maybe we didn't make eye contact because for some people in our community, more traditional people, we wouldn't. Looking at somebody straight in the eyes would be almost like you're confronting them or you're going to, it's combative. And you certainly wouldn't want to do that to an elder because you want to show respect. And so, maybe they weren't looking at people in the eyes. And so, and maybe not talking as much. And so it was also used in just very discriminative ways by defining them as dysfunctional ways of living or parenting, and used really as reasons for carrying out politically driven acts like boarding schools, removing children, placing them with non-Native parents. And so again, it's kind of really just getting a sense of this history behind tribal communities, and just gaining some more insight into these practices. And part of that, I think, really will help with understanding how do we approach, how do we work with these families, and in what ways can we help to connect them to that community. So with that, I think I will go ahead and wrap up and see if there's any questions that I may be able to answer.
I don't really have any questions, but I just want to say that I think this presentation, having worked in child welfare and then now being an educator, it's a good reminder to pay attention to those cultural things that are easy to forget if you're not immersed in it on a daily basis. And it was good to see the work that Dr. Bigfoot is doing. I've worked with her some through NASW, so very interesting and good take on some of these therapies. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment.
If you don't have question, you're also welcome to share some, I don't know, main take-home message, something that kind of was, I don't know, new or that was good to remind or that you would like to share.
Well, I would like to ask a question, and that is, I wonder, Dr. Coser, if you have children, or if you don't have children, maybe down the future you might hope to have children, what are some of the cultural traditions that you would like to pass on to your children, you personally?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have children yet, but you know, I've thought about that too, because it's I have 8 nieces and nephews, and so as I was talking about before, just the role of being an auntie has a very special place within our families, and so you know, always wanting to reinforce pride in their identity. I think is something that I always try to do and would want to do for my children as well. That it's good to be American Indian. You should be proud to be American Indian, and I think that probably really echoes the way I was raised, and my parents and the way they raised us. And that you know, we have a duty to our community. It's not just about us and just what we want, but, you know, we want to, let's say, get our higher education and then come back to the community, serve our community, be a voice for those that may not have a voice or that don't have a place at the table. How can we do that? And so I think, you know, definitely those values are the things that I think personally is something that I would want to reinforce in younger generations.
And another question, thank you for that. So personal. The aunt who is so in the life of the nephews, is this more the maternal aunt, the paternal aunt, or does it not matter?
Yeah. So and this is more so like our people and like Creek people, as I mentioned, there's differences just across tribes. You know, I'm talking with even my supervisor here. I know she talks about her family is more of a paternal, I can't think of the word. It's off the tip of my tongue, but our family is more, follows more the maternal side. Mm-hmm. And so we gain our identity from that maternal side. But in terms of practices like that, it's usually aunts with the girls and then the uncles with the boys, just within our family and our cultural practice. But again, that may be different for other families and tribes.
Thank you so much. It's been
Yes.
so interesting.